Okay, we're going to continue discussing CBT. So here we are back to discuss more of our psychology. We are in the part of the curriculum that has to do with self-care. Remember, this is a biopsychosocial spiritual continuum, our way of life. It's made up of our biology, our psychology or our mental health, our sociology or our relationships and our place in the world, or our spirituality, which is everything else, including morals and ethics and the inspiration of awe and principles of recovery such as gratitude and acceptance and love and compassion. And of course, biopsychosocial spiritual isn't really compartmentalized. It's a swirling mass of human experience. So we are talking about the self-care of our psychology and the psychology of self-care, the psychology of addiction, substance use disorder, the psychology of anxiety and depression, the psychology of trauma, and then of course the psychology or the mental health of recovery. So again, we have these two compartments. How do we get here, which is a place where we got a lot of mental health issues. And substance use disorder is considered a mental health disorder. It's in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. So we have a kind of on the one hand, on the left brain side, we have how did we get here, where our mental health is shaping and informing behaviors like drug and alcohol addiction, and then drug and alcohol addiction are shaping our behaviors, thoughts, and feelings, our psychology, right? So it goes both ways. And then what do we do about it? What are the skills that we can develop out of our understanding of our psychology and out of our understanding of addiction that can help us stop drinking, stop using, and manage our trauma stress response? Again, trauma stress response and addiction are going hand in hand in this program because it is a trauma-informed view of our behaviors, of our psychology. So what have we talked about? We've talked about substance use disorder as being a set of behaviors that include using drugs and alcohol that are shaped and informed by and also include the story of psychology, the stories of anxiety and depression and PTSD and OCD and all this other stuff. So you got a behavioral disorder, which is drinking and drugging as a trauma stress response. And then you've got a cognitive and emotional disorder, which is also psychological, that both shapes the drinking and drugging and is also shaped by the drinking and drugging. So again, you've got stress in your environment leads to thoughts and feelings and the behavior of using. And then using leads to stress, which impacts our thoughts and feelings. And using also, using drugs and alcohol impacts us cognitively and emotionally. So it's every which way. You've got things coming and going, boom, boom, boom. And what is the result? Complete and utter chaos, unmanageability in our lives, personality disorders, cognitive distortions, irrational thinking, emotional dysregulation, emotional flooding, emotional volatility, and then of course every dangerous behavior known to man. Remember, we are addressing in this program not just the behaviors of using drugs and alcohol, but behaviors that are also dangerous, that are associated with trauma and mental health and biopsychosocial spiritual, challenges. So that includes acting out in anger, like violence, argumentation, interpersonal relationship dysfunction, and then of course other forms of self-harm, eating, pornography, sex, gambling, any sort of behavior that makes our lives more unmanageable and takes us farther away from our goals. Again, throughout the program, I asked you all, what are the goals and objectives that you come with? Because we need to develop self-care skills to help reach those goals. So in the biological sphere, goals and objectives are to be healthier, right? And to be healthier. So you learn how to exercise and eat properly and get better sleep. Go to the doctor, take your medications. In the sociological area, the goals and objectives are to get along better with people, repair relationships, craft new relationships that are healthy. And then the spiritual goals are just to, use spiritual principles to help our lives be more peaceful and content. And then the mental health goals should be developing thought, feeling, and behavior patterns that help us do what? Avoid relapse, but also do a whole lot of other stuff. Develop contentment and peace of mind. And Maslow suggested that we need to meet all of our needs so we can be creative and reach our full potential. So whether it be bio, psychosocial, or spiritual, we have goals and objectives. Yes, quitting drugs and alcohol is primary on that list because all the other stuff can't happen if you're using drugs and alcohol. That is the theory of substance use disorder, that the drugs and the alcohol, whether they be symptomatic of your psychology or whether they drive your psychology or both, doesn't matter which, they are primary barrier to meeting your goals and objectives. Probation, child custody, contentment, peace of mind, self-care, you name it. Financial well-being, you name the sphere of your life, drugs and alcohol will challenge meeting those goals. So it's always good to review that. We mentioned the role of trauma in disrupting our psychology. That cannot be overestimated. Trauma, stress response, how trauma, especially adverse childhood experiences, how that shapes the way your mind works is incredibly impactful. In my experience with the folks that I work with, childhood trauma folks, adulthood trauma folks, PTSD, complex trauma folks, the trauma is always there historically and presently. Because what does trauma do? Trauma makes it nearly impossible, the way that it transforms your mind's vigilance towards stress and the reactivity to stress in your environment, makes it nearly impossible to be aware in the moment, calm, and it makes it nearly impossible to utilize the parts of our brain that really do separate us from many other creatures. Human beings, when they are calm, have the ability to problem solve and use their intelligence and intellect to a degree that is not seen in nature a whole lot. However, when trauma stress response kicks in, that all goes out the window, and the part of your brain that takes over is very similar to a reptile's brain or any other organism that wants to fight for its life. We become hyper vigilant to safety. And the great paradox and irony of trauma-informed behavioral health is that the way the brain works and has developed over time, or the way that it was created, whichever way you look at it, it was designed to save your life and avoid danger in kind of small doses. What repeated trauma does, or really significant anecdotal discrete trauma does, is it sets you up for a behavioral developmental pattern whereby you're going to get all jacked up and hypervigilant, and you're going to fight for your life, even if it's something minor like the wind gently blowing. You know, you survive a hurricane, and then every time the wind blows, your stress response and fight or flight amygdala part of your brain kicks in, and you're behaviorally chaotic. And that's where we see people get in trouble. So the role of trauma is absolutely huge in terms of shaping the way that our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors develop. They become patterns, and down the road you see, for example, trauma survivors who use drugs and alcohol, when stressed, or even just baseline because of the neural pathway blazing, these cognitive, emotional, behavioral patterns develop, so that we're basically one-trick ponies. We react with emotion, we react with cognitive distortion, and we react with unsafe behaviors. So let's have a look at cognitive distortion. A distorted thought, or a cognitive distortion, is an exaggerated pattern of thought that's not based on fact. So what is fact anyway? In the postmodern era, we have different facts, right? Everyone has a different version of fact. That's based on perspective. Well, let's stick in the realm of what we know. What's fact? Well, in arithmetic, 1 + 1 = 2. in geometry, this is a circle and this is a square. Those are facts. Those are reliable. We can do the research and everyone agrees that those are facts. When it comes to behavior, there are facts based on agreement, how folks ought not to behave violently, ought not to break the law and what have you. So, you can stick with those kind of facts. What's interesting about left brain psychology is opinion and perspective and judgment becomes fact in the eye of the beholder. So you see human beings basing their behavioral psychology on a set of facts that cannot be proven in any way, shape, or form. And this is called the modus operandi of the average human being, and especially trauma survivors. So you see a modus operandi, a way of operating, interacting with other human beings, the way that you eat, think, and exercise, the way that you respond to feelings, the way that you communicate language. Your behavioral patterns are based on thought systems and belief systems that aren't provable, that are just opinion. We see this everywhere. A cognitive distortion, in other words, is your mind convincing you, the self that does the behavior, to believe things about yourself and others and about the world that are probably not true and are probably not helpful to meeting your goals and objectives. Psychological studies on the average human being shows that the average thought process of a human being is pretty much irrational. It can't be proven. It's based on opinion. It may or may not be substantively true. And when it's something like, oh, my favorite color is green, or which road should I take to the beach to try to save 20 minutes on my travel time, that's one thing. But when it comes to a trauma survivor, a drug and alcohol abuser, we're starting to talk about things that are very, very destructive and can end up with significant consequences based on our understanding of CBT. All human beings fall into cognitive distortion territory baseline because of the way the mind works. My belief is it's the left brain running the show, which is all about labeling things and interpreting things and predicting things. So in other words, when you meet someone new, you have a good chance of distrusting that person because that person's an unknown quantity and your left brain is trying to predict what that person will do. Interestingly, facial recognition is associated with the right brain because it's about concepts. But what the left brain does is it says, I've met someone who looks like you before and that person was a jerk, so therefore I don't trust you and I don't like you. So left brain distorted thinking hijacks us, and we create what are called cognitive distortion patterns. And we're going to go through a list real quick. You can find these on the internet. Very classic cognitive distortion is called filtering. Mental filtering is draining and strains all the positives out of a situation. What the human brain does when it filters is it accentuates the negative and rejects the positive. And from an evolutionary psychology standpoint, that would help our early ancestors survive, because if you were more likely to focus on the negative or the danger in your environment, you were more likely to survive. Fast forward, about 800,000 years, and filtering in the hands of a substance use disorder and trauma person is absolutely deadly, because it convinces those human beings that everything is always bad and wrong, and there is no such thing as a good outcome. Sound a little bit like anxiety? Polarization or all or nothing thinking. It's the way that you think about yourselves, the world, or others in an all or nothing way. It's also called black or white thinking. Black or white means all or nothing, yes or no. Very classic left brain dichotomy. There are no shades of gray. There is no paradox. There is no nuance. And what we know about the world is very little is black and white. Just about everything is a shade of gray or a nuance. An example of that is that your coworker is viewed to be your friend and an absolute saint among human beings until she eats your sandwich, and now all of a sudden she's the enemy because she ate your sandwich. Or A student thinks it's the end of the world when they got a B instead of an A because it dropped their 4.0 down to 3.8. So it's either an A or nothing. An A means success. A B, C, or D is failure. So the big thing about all or nothing, black and white, polarized thinking is it's pass, fail, success, failure. So when it comes to relapse, the modern harm reductive view of relapse is, I made a mistake, a misstep, stress response. I'm learning how to manage stress and it's a behavioral pattern, but I failed utterly because I've relapsed and now all is lost. And then of course that is a very dangerous place to be indeed. Overgeneralization is a famous cognitive distortion. When you overgeneralize something, you take an isolated negative event and turn it into a never-ending pattern of loss and defeat. So when you use words like always, never, everything, or nothing, this is an overgeneralization. You stumble. You're playing tennis and you double fault on an important point, and your brain goes to, I always double fault under pressure. Well, that is a powerful belief system, and you're much more likely to double fault moving forward if you believe that you always do that. Again, always is the key word. Discounting the positive is a huge cognitive distortion. It's kind of the obverse or the opposite of negative filtering. This is when something positive happens, you dismiss it as luck or that never happens. It's similar to mental filtering. The main difference is that you dismiss it as something of no value. So in other words, something good happened and you're like, well, that's nothing compared to the bad thing that's about to happen. Discounting the positive. When you hit a nice shot in tennis and you say, oh, that was luck, or I couldn't do that again, that's discounting the positive. Jumping to conclusions. This is a huge one. You interpret an event or a situation negatively without evidence supporting such a conclusion. Then you react to that assumption. Classic example, a family member comes home looking very serious. Instead of asking how they are or what's going on, you just assume that they're angry at you. Another classic example is you get an email from your boss and you just assume that you're being fired or called out. Jumping to conclusions. Classic cognitive distortion. Associated with jumping to conclusions is fortune telling or mind reading. Matan has a serious look on his face, so I'm just assuming that he's doubting the veracity of the curriculum. I have no idea what he's thinking. I'm jumping to conclusions. I'm trying to read his mind, and I'm trying to fortune tell. That is classic left brain action right there. From an evolutionary psychology standpoint, if I can read his mind and I'm reading that he's angry at me, that way I can defend myself if he attacks me. So when human beings are very defensive because of trauma and drug addiction and low self-worth and et cetera, we tend to jump to conclusions. We tend to filter out the positive. We tend to discount the positive. We tend to accentuate the negative, and we try to fortune tell. And it's not based on reality. It's based on what? Assumption. Based on an interpretation of how we are and how the past has always been. Catastrophizing. Classic cognitive distortion. Classic anxiety mentality. Something happens and it's the worst case scenario. You're driving down the road and you get a sound underneath the hood and all of a sudden you jump to the conclusion that your car is going to blow up. It's the worst case scenario. Chicken Little, the sky is falling. Yes?
This is a really good list. I was just wondering if you could send the list.
Sure, absolutely. The internet's full of them too. The cognitive distortion usually or oftentimes comes with the red flag catchphrase of "what if." Hey, so we're gonna drive to the beach. Well, what if it rains? What if the car breaks down? What if? Your left brain will come up with a million what ifs in a vain and desperate attempt to control the future, to predict the future, and to somehow protect whatever's going on. It's a terrible way to live. Catastrophization is one of the most classic personality cognitive styles of PTSD and trauma. Personalization leads you to believe that you're responsible for events that are completely or partially out of your control. If you find yourself apologizing for things that you didn't have anything to do with, you are personalizing it. It results in you feeling guilty and blaming yourself all the time. Your child has an accident and you blame yourself for allowing them to go to that party. Like, your child, went to a party and tripped and chipped her tooth. It's my fault because I let them go to the party. Or you feel that had you woken your partner up, she would have been on time for work. Personalization. Personalization also is associated with the fallacy of blame. Blaming others or blaming yourself over and over and over as a fallacy, which means you can't possibly prove it. For example, the guy who broke the part on the HVAC. If I were to blame him, I would have to prove that he did it deliberately or that it was even an accident. When in reality, it was probably just an old part that just completely disintegrated in his hand. There's no blame there, unless you want to blame erosion and time. And I'm sure there's a cognitive distortion for that too. Control fallacies. Here's a good one. When we talk about acceptance all the time in recovery, we have to talk about the fallacy of control. A fallacy is an illusion, a misconception, or an error. Control fallacies, you either feel responsible or in control of everything. So you see a lot of OCD, like a lot of control freaks, as they say. In control, you are in control of your life or others completely. Or you feel like you have no control whatsoever, which could lead to panic. So you see someone like a certain politician that was famous trying to control everything through the cult of his personality, or you see someone who is likely to panic under stress because they feel completely out of control. You see a lot of those two polar opposites in drug addiction. I'm going to do drugs to control my environment, I'm going to put in my body, or you use drugs and you feel completely out of control. The fallacy of fairness. I see this a lot in recovery. People say, that's not fair. I'm on probation, I'm on CPS, that's not fair. Fair is a fallacy because you can't prove it. Just like human rights are an illusion because you can't prove them. And if they're broken all the time, then how in the world is that something that you can quantify or qualify? Fairness. The legal system is based on the fallacy of fairness. But as we know, laws change, which means that it's a bit of an illusion. For example, a certain law was revoked that has got a lot of people up in arms, and a lot of that, I'm afraid, a lot of that emotional response is based on the fallacy of fairness. There is no law that can't be repealed, and there is no amendment that people look at amendments as being set in stone, and I'll always have the ability to do this, that, or the other. That's a fallacy, and that's proven by the recent events. The fallacy of fairness. If you understand that fair is an illusion, you're much more likely to go with the flow and follow rules that otherwise you would break because they are unfair. Classic example is CPS and probation. The fallacy of, don't tell me that it's unfair. You're in it. And if you signed up for drug court, then you're really in it, and fair has nothing to do with it because you signed up for it. Same thing with this program. Oh, it's not fair, you changed the schedule. Well, guess what? I make the rules so I say what's fair. And if you don't think that's fair, we can have a conversation about it. But it's very illusory, right? It's hard to grasp. It's hard to grasp. You can hold a law book, but the laws within it are very illusory. Blaming, the fallacy of blame. People blame themselves or they blame others all the time. It's one of the most common fallacies. Shoulds. Whenever you use should or shouldn't, it's a cognitive distortion because good luck proving that you should or should have done something. When you're talking, unless you got a time machine to go back and change the past, you are grasping at straws. Emotional reasoning is a huge one. That means I feel angry, so therefore I get to blank. I feel sad, so therefore I get to blank. Feelings aren't real that way. They just are. Feelings are signals of something going on in your environment and within your psyche. And it doesn't mean that you should or can behave according to that feeling. The classic example is, I'm anxious, I'm depressed, I'm frustrated, I'm angry, so I get to use a bunch of drugs. Emotional reasoning is entitlement, and it is death on a stick. Feeling inadequate turns into I don't belong anywhere. I relapse, therefore I'm worthless. Emotional reasoning. The fallacy of change has you expecting other people will change their ways to suit your needs or expectations. The fallacy of change. Well, this is how I think things should operate. Therefore, it's my way or the highway. That's a huge illusion. Global labeling refers to taking a single attribute and turning it into an absolute. This happens when you judge and then define yourself or others based on an isolated event. The labels assigned are usually negative and extreme. You see your new teammate applying makeup before a meeting, your work teammate applying makeup before a meeting, and you call them shallow because she's using makeup. Or they don't submit a report on time and you label them useless. Unfortunately, global labeling happens a lot on social media. Racism is partially global labeling, especially if you look at a certain member of a certain group, and if they're a criminal, then all of a sudden all blanks are criminals. That's global labeling. Total distorted thinking. The fallacy of always being right. Here's a good one. Based on the fear of being wrong, that if you're wrong, you lose your prestige or you lose your control. My way or the highway, I'm always right. A huge fallacy, a huge cognitive distortion. Folks, we're going to learn about how to turn these distortions around and straighten out our thinking. Remember, if thinking is linear, which Western civilization likes to imagine, say that you started off thinking 1 + 1 = 2, all human beings are awesome. Trauma hits, you develop beliefs and opinions, and they become layered and layered and layered and very rigid and black and white. All of a sudden your thinking is askew. Well, at first it may seem somewhat accurate. 10 years later, you're so far off of a linear path that it's literally delusional. So what we see by the time people hit group or watching this video, their beliefs are really just opinions and judgments and assumptions that are impossible to prove, are delusional, illusional, and sometimes just absolutely chaotic. So that's cognitive distortion. We will review them again tomorrow. Probably go a little bit slower so folks can process them. I want you all to start looking at these distortion categories and see how much you're using them. Black and white thinking, filtering, discounting the positive, catastrophization, blame, the fallacy of fairness. These are all things these are all cognitive distortion categories that I think people can relate to. Most people end up saying, I do all of those all the time. So what we're going to do is we're going to understand how our thinking is twisted. And remember, it's all based in CBT theory, which to me is not so much theory as it is gospel. It's all based in trauma stress response that leads to emotional dysregulation, which leads to a flare-up of this cognitive distortion belief system. And then you can look at your behaviors of self-harm or the behaviors that you're being judged for and being your dysfunctional behaviors as rooted in that emotional flooding or dysregulation, which is informed by these belief systems, this cognitive style, or creates the cognitive style, or both. So again, more psychological self-care. The skills that we develop, the right brain part of the curriculum is, okay, so now we've identified how our psychology is a little jacked up, so now we're going to figure out how to straighten up and fly right. And that is a behavioral concept that should be attractive to many people. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you all soon.